Hello, and welcome to the last video for the Hurricane Hazard Series for South Carolina's Hurricane Preparedness Month. My name is Melissa Griffin, and I'm the Assistant State Climatologist of South Carolina. The State Climate Office has partnered with the 4 National Weather Service offices that serve South Carolina to bring you a 5-part series that provides an in-depth discussion on strong winds and tornadoes, storm surge and coastal impacts, heavy rain and inland flooding, and rip currents and offshore impacts. Today's video will discuss the history of some of the most impactful hurricanes that have affected South Carolina. Since 1850, there have been 25 hurricanes that have made a direct landfall along the South Carolina coast. Of these 25 hurricanes, 4 were considered major hurricanes at the time of landfall, including a Category 3 hurricane that made landfall near Charleston in 1893, and 3 Category 4 hurricanes, Hazel in 1954, Gracie in 1959, and Hugo in 1989. Here is a quick look at where these 25 hurricanes made landfall along the South Carolina coast. These storms have impacted the coast from Hilton Head Island up to the North Carolina border, impacting communities such as Beaufort, Charleston, Georgetown, Myrtle Beach, and North Myrtle Beach. However, when we examine the tracks of the storms that have impacted South Carolina, we see a complex web of multicolored lines mapping the varied paths of hurricanes, tropical storms, tropical depressions, and subtropical storms over the years. Many storms have passed offshore or made landfall in neighboring states, yet still brought significant impacts such as heavy rain, flooding, and strong winds well inland and across the state. Let's explore a few of these storms from South Carolina's history. The Sea Islands hurricane made landfall south of Georgia on August 28, 1893, as a very large Category 3 hurricane with peak winds of 115 miles an hour. The storm moved north-northeast, passing west of Beaufort, South Carolina, and headed towards the South Carolina Midlands. The storm was still a Category 1 hurricane when the center reached Columbia, South Carolina, and was a tropical storm by the time it moved through Charlotte, North Carolina. The storm tide along the coast was nearly 16 feet, and many coastal communities in Georgia and South Carolina were inundated and isolated. The battery in Charleston sustained heavy damage, and numerous ships were sunk in Charleston Harbor. Tropical storm force winds extended out more than 220 miles from the storm's center, making it larger in size than Hurricane Hugo. Even Spartanburg suffered moderate damage, and high winds and heavy rain destroyed crops across the entire state. Tragically, at least 1,000 and possibly 2,000 people lost their lives, and the resulting damage in the state marked the decline of rice cultivation and the phosphate industry in the region. Just over a month after the Sea Islands hurricane, a second major storm impacted the state. Called the Great Charleston Hurricane of 1893, the storm moved along the Georgia coast before making landfall north of Charleston as a Category 3 hurricane with winds of 120 miles an hour. The hurricane caused significant flooding, as the ground was already saturated from previous storms. This further hampered recovery efforts in areas still reeling from the Sea Islands hurricane. Later analysis determined that the storm was compact in size, with the most severe storm-type damage occurring north of McClellanville, where the water levels exceeded those recorded just weeks before during the Sea Islands hurricane. The wind damage was also extensive across portions of Georgetown and Horry counties. On July 5, 1916, a Category 3 hurricane made landfall near Pascagoula, Mississippi, and stalled over central Alabama for a few days, producing heavy rains across portions of the southeast United States. Flooding was reported in some of the upstate watersheds, and river heights were still high when a Category 2 hurricane made landfall near Bulls Bay, South Carolina on July 14, 1916, with winds of 80 miles an hour. Tracking northwest across South Carolina, the storm unleashed record-breaking rainfall and widespread flooding. In Effingham, South Carolina, 13.25 inches of rain fell in just 24 hours. More than 700,000 of acres of crops were destroyed. and the Santee River system experienced devastating flooding, with water levels surpassing all of the previous benchmarks since 1840. Severe damage also struck portions of the Lynches and Black River basins. The torrential rain from both hurricanes caused the Great Flood of 1916, which devastated parts of western North Carolina and triggered further downstream flooding into South Carolina. Statewide, July 1916 remains the wettest month on record, averaging 14.41 inches of precipitation, and the station at Kingstree recorded a total of 31.13 inches of rain for the month. Just weeks after the Haiti hurricane of 1928 made landfall along the Florida Big Bend and caused 6 to 10 inches of rain across portions of the upstate, the Okeechobee hurricane made a second landfall near Edisto Island as a Category 1 hurricane. The storm caused devastating flooding in South Florida, where the strong winds caused a storm surge that led to the failure of earthen dams on the northern and southern shores of Lake Okeechobee. Rivers were already high from heavy rains at the beginning of September, and the 7 to 10 additional inches of rain caused by the storm led to extensive flooding across the Pee Dee region of the state. The Black River at Kingstree crested at 18 feet. The flooding in the lower portion of the Black and Pee Dee River basins lingered into the beginning of October. In some locations, it was compared to and surpassed the conditions that were experienced in July of 1916. The winds also caused severe damage to trees, and the combination of the heavy rain and wind ruined crops, especially corn and cotton planted in the area. This Category 2 hurricane, known as the South Carolina hurricane, made landfall near Hilton Head with winds of 105 miles per hour on the afternoon of August the 11th. The hurricane weakened to a tropical storm as it moved through Georgia, and then curved to the north and slowly moved towards eastern Tennessee. The storm tide measured up to 13 feet along portions of the coast, causing property damage from Folly Beach to Beaufort, including the U.S. Marine Corps base on Parris Island and the town of Port Royal. Locations in the Lowcountry and portions of the upstate recorded more than 10 inches of rain. Strong winds caused tree and roof damage as far as 50 miles inland from the coast, and the heavy rain and winds caused extensive crop losses, especially to corn, hay, and cotton crops in the Lowcountry. The Homestead hurricane made landfall as a Category 4 storm near Key Largo, Florida, on the afternoon of September the 15th. The storm moved northeast across the Florida peninsula and made a second landfall south of Hilton Head on September the 17th as a strong tropical storm. The storm made landfall at low tide, which limited the storm's surge impacts along most of the coast. Most of the damage resulted from heavy rain and strong winds. Earlier in the month, rainfall had already elevated river levels, setting the stage for flooding when the storm's rains began on September the 16th. Widespread totals of 7 to 10 inches were reported across the coastal plain from the storm. An observer in Cheraw recorded 17.34 inches of rain from September 1st to September 18th. Nearly all rivers in the central and eastern portions of the state exceeded flood stage in late September due to the rainfall draining from North Carolina into South Carolina. The resulting flood caused severe damage to property and crops, especially corn, cotton, and peanuts. Hurricane Hazel made landfall as a Category 4 storm around mid-morning on October 15, 1954. Hazel made landfall during the October full moon cycle, and this timing contributed to significant storm surge along parts of the South Carolina and North Carolina coasts. Hazel remains the northernmost Category 4 hurricane to make landfall on the Atlantic coast. Storm surge from Hurricane Hazel ranged from 14 to 17 feet, severely impacting communities such as Garden City, Surfside Beach, Myrtle Beach, and North Myrtle Beach. In Garden City, more than 200 homes were either severely damaged or swept off their foundations. A station in Myrtle Beach recorded wind gusts up to 106 miles an hour, while winds along the coast between Myrtle Beach and Cape Fear, North Carolina, were estimated to exceed 130 miles per hour. Hurricane-force winds battered the region for nearly 3 hours, causing extensive damage to trees and structures throughout northeastern South Carolina and eastern North Carolina. At the time of Hazel's landfall, the region was experiencing one of its most severe droughts on record. Rainfall was mostly limited to parts of the Pee Dee region and eastern North Carolina, offering little relief from the persistent dryness elsewhere in the state. The Black River near Gable, which had been dry for over 2 months, began flowing again about 4 days after Hazel passed. However, the river level started to decline by the end of the month. The 1959 hurricane season brought 2 hurricanes ashore along the South Carolina coast. Hurricane Cindy quickly developed offshore on July 8th and made landfall near McClellanville as a Category 1 storm, causing only minor damage. However, Hurricane Gracie was far more intense, making landfall near St. Helena Sound on September 29th as a Category 4 storm with winds exceeding 130 miles an hour. Gracie intensified from a Category 1 to a Category 4 storms in just 48 hours before landfall. Beaufort and the surrounding communities suffered extensive wind damage, with trees, power lines, and utility poles knocked down throughout the region. The heavy rain caused flooding, inundating roads and low-lying areas. Crops in the Low Country, especially cotton and tobacco, were severely damaged by the combination of the strong winds and torrential rain. At Edisto Beach, the highest storm tide reached approximately 12 feet, and the Charleston Harbor recorded a storm surge of about 9 feet. However, the timing of the storm making landfall at low tide helped prevent even more significant flooding. In 1989, Hurricane Hugo made landfall near Sullivan's Island around midnight on September the 22nd. Hurricane Hugo is considered one of the strongest hurricanes to make landfall along the South Carolina coast. The storm had sustained winds near 140 miles an hour at landfall, and due to its fast forward speed and large size, hurricane-force winds were recorded well inland. A gust of 109 miles an hour was recorded at Shaw Air Force Base, and gusts up to 100 miles an hour were recorded in Charlotte, North Carolina. Hugo caused extensive wind damage across South Carolina and North Carolina. Roughly 75% of the trees in the Francis Marion National Forest were either sheared off or blown down. Up to 80% of the roofs in the Charleston area were damaged, and a crane at the port of Charleston was destroyed. There were numerous reports of downed trees and structural damage in inland counties from the strong winds. Although Hugo made landfall just before high tide, the storm still produced destructive storm tides, reaching 10 feet in Charleston Harbor, 15 feet in parts of the Grand Strand, and peaking at 20 feet above sea level in Bulls Bay. The storm surge was so powerful that boats were swept from rivers and marshes and deposited far inland across highways and in neighborhoods. Beachfront homes, hotels, and condos from Sullivan's Island to Myrtle Beach bore the brunt of the surge, with many structures destroyed or heavily damaged. Rainfall totals from Hugo were limited by the fast movement of the storm. However, portions of South Carolina still saw up to 10 inches of rain, with Edisto Island recording the highest amount at 10.28 inches. In 2016, Hurricane Matthew tracked just off the east coast of Florida and Georgia, making landfall near McClellanville, South Carolina, on the morning of October 8th as a Category 1 hurricane. Matthew became the first October hurricane to make landfall north of Florida since Hurricane Hazel in 1954. The storm produced hurricane-force wind gusts along the entire coast and well inland. Coastal flooding from high storm tides was recorded from Fort Pulaski, Georgia, to Hatteras, North Carolina, and severe beach erosion was observed from Edisto Island to the Isle of Palms. The storm dumped 10 to 17 inches of rain from Savannah, Georgia, through Florence, South Carolina, and into a wide area of eastern North Carolina. The heaviest rains fell across the Pee Dee Basin and into North Carolina, where significant flooding occurred. On October 12th, the Little Pee River at Gallivant's Ferry rose to 17.1 feet. The Waccamaw near Conway recorded a flood stage of 17.89 feet on October 18th, surpassing the flood of September 1928. The Waccamaw River near Conway finally dropped below flood stage at the beginning of November. Hurricane Florence was a Category 1 hurricane when it made landfall near Wrightsville Beach, North Carolina on September 14th. It proceeded to stall and remain nearly stationary for an entire day before it began a slow turn to the southwest, which is not typical movement for tropical cyclones. It traveled across South Carolina at 2 to 3 miles per hour. The storm continued to weaken during the 15th and finally accelerated to the north-northeast and out of the state on September 16th. The slow-moving system dropped more than 30 inches of rain across portions of eastern North Carolina and over 20 inches of rain in portions of Chesterfield and Horry counties. Unprecedented flooding occurred in Florence's wake, as a portion of the excessive rainfall measured in North Carolina fell in the Yadkin Pee River watershed. For weeks after the initial landfall, flooding plagued most of the Pee region, with significant impacts along the Black, Pee, Little Pee, Lumber, Lynches, and Waccamaw rivers. Several rivers set new record crest values. The Pee River at Pee reached a height of 31.83 feet, which was 1.5 feet lower than the historic crest that was set in 1945. Gauges along the Waccamaw River exceeded previous record crests by 3 or more feet during the event. Hurricane Ian made landfall along the southwest Florida coast as a Category 5 hurricane on September 28th. The storm quickly moved across the Florida peninsula, emerging over the Atlantic Ocean as a tropical storm. The storm re-strengthened to a Category 1 hurricane before making a second landfall near Georgetown on September 30th. The track of Hurricane Ian was very reminiscent of that of Hurricane Charley in 2004. The storm caused a 3 to 6 foot storm surge, damaging homes and businesses along the northeast coast of South Carolina. The storm surge also breached the dunes, depositing sand up to 3 feet deep in portions of the beachfront roads. Severe erosion occurred from Garden City northward to North Myrtle Beach. Wind gusts up to 60 miles an hour caused some structural damage in portions of Georgetown and Horry counties. 4 to 8 inches of rain fell from the storm, with isolated amounts up to 10 inches across portions of the coastal plains and Midlands. While this rainfall caused flash flooding in some areas, it did not cause any major river flooding. Hurricane Debby made landfall along the Big Bend of Florida as a Category 1 hurricane on the morning of August the 5th, before weakening into a tropical storm as it moved across southeastern Georgia. The storm recurved back to the northwest and came ashore as a tropical storm near Bulls Bay on August the 8th. Debby slowly moved through South Carolina, producing heavy rain and widespread flash flooding, prompting numerous road closures, including portions of Interstate 26. Rainfall totals across the coastal plain ranged from 6 to 12 inches, and an observer in Moncks Corner reported a storm total of 22.02 inches of rain. The storm caused 8 tornadoes across the South Carolina low country. Scattered tree damage from near tropical storm-force winds resulted in some power and communication outages. The storm surge from Debby was minimal, with no significant coastal flooding reporting along the South Carolina coast. Hurricane Helene made landfall as a Category 4 hurricane near Perry, Florida during the late evening of September 26. Helene then continued moving quickly northward into northeast Georgia and across eastern Tennessee into central Kentucky by September the 27th. It weakened below tropical storm strength, but stalled and produced heavy rains across portions of the South Carolina upstate. The storm's expansive wind field brought tropical storm-force winds to much of Georgia and South Carolina, causing extensive tree damage and power outages. In some southeast Georgia and South Carolina counties, nearly all residents lost power. According to a National Weather Service report, wind gusts approached 100 miles per hour along the Savannah River north of Augusta, particularly in McCormick and Edgefield counties. A station in Jocassee, South Carolina, measured 19.69 inches of rain, with over a foot falling in several upstate counties. Severe river flooding followed, with record crests on the Reedy, Saluda, and Broad Rivers, and other rivers nearing historic highs. The storm also spawned 21 tornadoes, the largest tropical tornado outbreak in South Carolina since Francis spawned 46 tornadoes in 2004. This has only been a brief overview of some of the most significant tropical cyclones to affect South Carolina. For more detailed information on these and other storms, explore the South Carolina Hurricane and Tropical Storms Database, which provides searchable records dating back to 1851. This concludes our last presentation in the Hurricane Hazard Series for South Carolina's Hurricane Preparedness Month. Please check back with the National Weather Service Columbia YouTube channel to watch any of the videos that you may have missed in this series. Thank you for watching.